All right, so first up is John.
Let's see. All right, what am I talking about today? Oh, Opsy. Okay.
The table you added.
Yeah.
John,
Okay.
is
Yeah.
that-
Let's do that. Sorry, there was just a lot of open topics. So somewhere there's a table with colors. Okay. Yeah. So in previous weeks we talked about different options for doing the Z-tunnel authorization policy or network policy or what we should do. I want to see if we could drive towards consensus on that. My opinion, and I think this sounded like kind of weak consensus last week, was we would add a I forget what you call it, a proxy class, or we could probably come up with a better name, but some class on the authorization policy to define what it's for. And there was some hand-wavy discussion of like, oh, well, we'll do certain behavior based on the type of the policy in the class, and that's what this table shows. The table is favoring being extremely precise and not a concise explanation. That's why it's 25 lines. I think our docs could be much more concise than this and still get the message across. So if you're seeing this giant table and think it's too complicated, you might be right, but hopefully that's not over-indexing on that. So I guess what I wanted to talk about was, is there, like, how are people feeling? Do we like proxy class? Should we explore other options? Do we need more details on how it would work? Do we want to debate the details of how it works? So yeah, any opinions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question on this.
Oh, sorry. All right.
Okay, so I have a question: this proxy class, why do we really need it? So, for example, let's say if we go with like one single policy spec, one single API, and if there is a parent ref, then we'll directly apply it to Waypoint. If there is no parent ref, we'll apply to Z-tunnel, sidecars, and gateways. And
the issue that we're trying to solve is identifying which requests are meant for a Z-tunnel and which are not. Because the issue is that Z-tunnel can only ever do L4 policy, right? And so basically, if we don't have a way to say this policy is only for the Z-tunnel, then any policy that we have that has an L7 attribute and a namespace is going to break in Z-tunnel, right?
So let's say if there's a workload selector, right? And if it selects some pod, and if that pod is linked to Z-tunnel, then we should apply the policy to Z-tunnel, right?
Well, that's the issue, is that if you say I have to apply like a namespace policy with L7 attribute, right? Now, I may have wanted that to say, oh, I just want to apply that to sidecars because I know all my sidecars. Maybe I even put a port and say, like, this only applies to port 80, and I know all my applications run HTTP there, right? That would be totally fine with sidecars, but now that policy is also going to apply to Z-tunnel because we haven't scoped to where we want it to apply to. And all requests to Z-tunnel are L4 only, so we'd have to deny them, right? So you can very easily accidentally, it's basically like the issue that you try to solve with sidecars, but much worse. But even worse is like, we want to, so there's kind of two ways. So when you have, ignoring sidecars, when you have the waypoint and Z-tunnel request path, there's kind of two options for authorization policy enforcement. We can say, okay, you had a waypoint, the waypoint must have done the policy enforcement. If the request came from waypoint, we just pass it through in Z-tunnel and don't do any policy, right? That model would work fine without this, I think. I think a safer model is to have separate layers with separate policies, so we have defense and depth, similar to in sidecars how you can have network policy at the L3, L4 layer, and then authorization policy at the L7 layer, right? So if we do that, then we need to clearly say these policies are for the waypoints, and I can put all my L7 attributes there and whatnot. And these policies are for the Z-tunnel, and we can actually reject if they even try to put L7 attributes, so we don't run into the issue of them accidentally doing it and then denying at runtime.
Okay, so my only concern with this is right now with this approach, we're going to have like two different policy spec, one for Z-tunnel, one for the waypoint, right? So we can have like one single policy spec. If someone is specifically specifying the parent ref, then we should like promote a message like, if you want to apply the policy L7 policies, L7 attributes, then you should have parent ref, and we choose to not apply policies on ZTNL if it's like the L7 attributes.
Yeah, my concern with this implicitness is like, it's kind of weird to say, okay, I want to request that, allows, I don't know, only requests from RN, and then I change some random attribute and add L7, and suddenly it stops applying at all, right? Like, is there ways we could make it work? We could probably implement it, but to me, like, being very explicit is much more clear. Like, the alternative really that we initially thought was using network policy as is. So it's very clear, like, this is your L4 API, this is your L7 API, right? And they layer. So that's effectively what this is doing. It's just reusing authorization policy for syntax reasons.
Okay. Can't we do something like what we do in the current TCP filters? Like if there's some HTTP attributes, we just remove it from ZTNL in the policy.
Remember that this was a major problem and how much we discussed it and how we agreed that it's the wrong thing to do, but we need to keep it just for backward compatibility. So I don't think anyone believes that this is the right path or the right thing to do, and we should not promote it maybe too.
Okay.
Ethan, you're like not muted, but we can't hear you.
Sorry, I have 2 mute buttons. I don't think this is that out of pattern. You've got an L4 layer, you've got an L7 layer. They kind of handle different things. There's nothing implicit. I think the L4 policy API is not that dissimilar to what some other of the more advanced CNIs are doing. I definitely do not want a world where we're kind of like implicitly guessing how to apply the policy depending on the network architecture. That seems scary. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Quad?
Yeah. We should.
Yeah, my concern is, I don't have a proposal, but I have a concern of the fact that we have to reference infrastructure components in the API, because that will complicate any migration between infrastructures. For example, if you have a policy set that refers to waypoints per service account, and you want to migrate to policies that refer to waypoints per namespace. So now you have to rewrite every policy, and that means your infrastructure is now immutable, which is a problem because it will make us not able to migrate users when next version of Ambient happens, for example.
I kind of agree with Quat on this one, but didn't we decide that waypoints are represented by gateway resources?
I think so. From last week on layer 7 OSC policy, you'd have to bind to the waypoints through the reference to the gateway. So
I think we can address Quat's concern by having the reference to the gateway, which is what Gamma and gateways are doing as well, not to the workload selector. John?
So that is how it's referenced. You do a parent ref to the gateway object.
So
But I mean, Quad could still have concerns with that reasonably. Do you?
Well, assuming that the stability of the Gamma API, like, are we going to have this notion of namespace and service account gateways forever, or is it just a temporary situation? Right?
Kubernetes gateways, data HTTP route, and all the other things are kind of moving to stable full speed. I don't think it's going to be more stable than a lot of other things are doing.
Well, as long as we represent reference to the config, not the physical infrastructure.
Yes, I agree with that. Today, those are coupled one-to-one, but they aren't necessarily in the future.
Right, and I think we need to make it very explicit somewhere. It's hard to say when you say waypoint. Does it mean the waypoint intent or the waypoint physical waypoint, right? Because I think the intent is fine. Reference to an intent is fine, but reference to the physical deployment is not okay, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think I'll clarify, but it's the intent. So, like, you could imagine hypothetically, the user creates 5 gateway objects in 5 different namespaces, but that's implemented by one mega proxy that lives in other cluster or something, right? I think that would be perfectly fine Now, in the Istio model as implemented today, they are one-to-one, but that's not a requirement, right?
And I would add that there is no requirement that a waypoint or gateway is actually an Istio component. Any other, Kubernetes Gamma gateway that supports this policy, that happens to implement this policy, will also work equally well. So if you put Consul or whatever as a gateway and they implement these APIs, that will be perfectly fair.
Yeah, so I think what's missing is probably we need to define very well what the intent of a gateway is. I think right now it's sort of the gateway spec is what the intent is, but I think that's the critical bit here. Because referring to that seems fine, because then anyone else can implement the waypoint as they wish, including non-envoy. But if we somehow have to refer to waypoint by its name, that's just not right.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case, and I totally agree. Like the intent is that a gateway represents the waypoint, and we could have an option to disable us creating the actual Envoy deployment, and someone else could add something that deploys Nginx or something, right? And so those two are not tightly coupled. We only have one implementation where they're tightly coupled, but I totally agree that shouldn't be the case, and I will make sure that's clarified in the doc. Does that address all your concerns?
Well, that's one concern, but another concern is mostly about I mean, we start from a situation where we have like a virtual waypoint per service account, because that's sort of what our model is in Istio. And so we need to make it easy to migrate to a situation where waypoints are shared. And if you have to create these waypoint resources using gateway APIs, that means your policies also have to change, and it just makes migration complicated. So we need to do something to make it easier to migrate existing policies.
Yeah, I think at one point we have one idea is to bind the policy to the identity. Is this still an option we want to consider? The advantage is
that's one thing, but we also have this model where you have waypoint per namespace now, right? So you cannot apply per service account policy on a waypoint per namespace. Because we don't know what service account.
I thought there's one thought is to bind the waypoints to each service account. Or have we decided it's only per namespace?
I think the intent is that waypoints can be implemented as per service account, per gateway, or as infrastructure. So I don't think we want to make any policy decisions that assumes that we'll only have one waypoint per service account.
How about when you bind it to a namespace, just to consider the default service account in the namespace?
Again, some vendors may choose to have infrastructures that is shared across multi-tenant or something that is not necessarily one physical workload per namespace.
Well, Question then have a problem, right? I mean, how are we going to migrate people? Right? If we start with a default waypoint per namespace, you can't even express a policy now, right?
I assume when vendors or whoever implements other things will have different classes of gateway. Gateway class provides different, and users will opt into that. It's not a migration issue. They can still choose to have per namespace, per whatever they want. It's not, but there will be other options being provided, I suspect. Just like they can migrate from Istio to some other implementation of gateway. It's not gateway class.
Yeah, I have more specific questions, like how do we migrate existing policies, right? Like what's the guide? Like if we start with Ambient by default having, say, one waypoint per namespace or per cluster, and your policies implicitly refer to destination principal using workload selectors, like what do we say to them?
Yeah, I think we would say that if they want more granular policies, they should have more granular waypoints and do per service account waypoints. And if they need even more granular than service account, then this is really what we were debating quite a bit a couple weeks ago, is that we can't actually represent that today. So they'd have to do more invasive changes like splitting up their workloads to use different service accounts. But our hypothesis was that that would be a very small number of users in that case.
Yeah, I remember that, but I agree. I think it's probably unlikely to have per within service account, but now we're talking
Yep.
about within namespace, right?
Yep.
So-
Do we have any data saying that there's only one policy per namespace, not per service account within a namespace?
No. The policy is not, it can refer to service. I mean, it's not the granularity that it's you have a policy only for namespace. In the policy, you can refer, if it goes to service X, you apply some policy. If it goes to, have the content of the policy itself, it's making it, granular.
But I mean, we already agreed not to do, L7 policy after the load balancing. And if your service account spans if your service spans two service accounts, you don't know which service account the service stands for.
Yeah, for this case, you need this granularity, you keep using sidecars. So I don't think they're deprecating sidecars or the old policies. And they're not trying to force migrate anyone. If you want better performance, simpler life, easier maintenance, and so forth, you use Gateway API, use Gamma API, and use this more restrictive set of features. Or you can use sidecars. So it's not, you still have the ability to express what you need if you absolutely need to distinguish between client sidecar, service accounts.
Yeah, I agree that sidecars are always an option, but I mean, eventually we do want people to use Ambient, and so I think we do need some way to migrate. Otherwise, you'll just use sidecars forever, and might be also a possibility, but I don't know.
I don't think we necessarily want, I personally don't want this. I want people who need advanced features or super complicated things to keep using sidecars, and people who want easy to maintain, simpler, faster things to use Ambient. I don't think we want to mix it, because then we'll have to implement all those crazy features in Ambient and make Ambient slow. So I think it's in our interest to keep the complex stuff on sidecar only, and keep sidecar alive just for the very special use cases, and not try to re-implement everything again in Ambient. That's my opinion.
So my question is, if we go with the simple path, can we add complexity later if we need to? And I don't have a sense that we're making any decisions to close options, and we don't know what people will want until they use it. So that's kind of the general principle.
Right. I mean, if we make it explicit, right, that means we're stuck with it forever. So the problem is, the benefit of implicit is that you have flexibility to choose later. But if you make it explicit, whether all this the layout and references, then it has to be that way forever, right?
Yeah, I actually wasn't putting my thumb on the scale as one option being simpler. I was just laying out the principle that I think what we should choose right now is the most future-proof option, not necessarily the most feature-rich option.
Obviously, we have options because it's, that's what we are doing right now. I mean, we are adopting the Kubernetes gateway model where we refer Apache policies or whatever to the gateway HTTP route, and we still support the old one. So if we find that later, like Ethan was saying, we need to introduce more granularity, we can obviously add it.
So where did we land? Did we land somewhere? What's the...
It seems like we're in favor of adding this proxy class. Is that, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Aryan, you seem to have some concerns. I don't know if those were questions, or we should not do this, or what the status is. Sounds like at least me and Constant think this is the right path forward for now. So
I think it's fine. Like, I agree with the Constant and you on this.
Okay, cool. I guess from my perspective, I do agree proxy class seems right. I was a little bit intimidated by the table you put together, John. Particularly the semantics difference between gateway and waypoint, I think could be potentially confusing to user, especially a lot of time people are going to think waypoint as a gateway. So the semantics here, such as the semantic for selector and the parent ref, right? The inconsistency would be interesting. But by the way, are you suggesting for the parent ref, are you suggesting for RC policy, not only I can bind to a parent ref for waypoint, I can also bind a parent ref to waypoint, to the gateway now? With
That
with
is
the
what I was
new addition?
suggesting.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just for consistency. And they would actually be gateway and waypoint could be exactly the same, but I don't think we want selector for waypoint. And we have to have selector for gateway for backwards compatibility.
For backwards compatible. Yeah,
So-
that's okay. So at least parent ref is consistency. The only thing that's not consistency would be the selector. Okay.
John, if I can make a suggestion, can you add an I in front of gateway? So I gateway or Istio gateway, and then add copy that to K gateway, which is Kubernetes gateway, and add for more rows for, because there are two gateways, and I don't think when I read it, I thought you were talking about Istio gateway, but
Oh, so disallow.
so I'm saying is you have gateway. Which one do you mean? I think Lin understood it's
Well, I meant both kind of, but I guess.
I
They're
thought it was
different, I mean.
both. Yeah.
it cannot
But
be both
it-
because
So maybe you're suggesting that for Istio gateway only selector and for Kubernetes gateway only parent ref.
I'm not suggesting. I'm saying the Kubernetes spec is saying that for Kubernetes gateway, you use parent ref, just like you use for waypoint, and Istio is different. So it's not my suggestion. It's that Kubernetes that decided that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we technically do have potential backwards compatibility concerns. I guess
Not
it's-
necessarily. If you use Kubernetes gateway API group, you get the Kubernetes API behavior. And I think that will be identical with waypoint. So waypoint and Kubernetes gateway would be more or less identical, and there will be no difference between them. And that's what we are using in our example. I mean, I don't even know why we care about the old Istio gateway. I mean, we can just leave it as it is with the existing APIs, existing servers like sidecars, and focus on the. So we just add a section saying this is Kubernetes gateway, and that's identical to waypoint. And for Istio gateway, no changes whatsoever. Stability rules.
Okay, I think I mostly agree. The only thing I'm concerned about is if we say in the next release, you're already using Kubernetes gateway and you're using selector policies on it, but then we say now selectors don't apply to Kubernetes gateway.
So that's the
would be-
Kubernetes choice, not ours. I mean, again, it's not yet.
It is beta. Let's see what we say about beta.
Well, the Kubernetes API is beta, not our vendor policies that may or may not attach to Kubernetes gateway.
Yeah, that could be a ambiguous escape hatch.
Will not break them. It's just that moving forward, we should support waypoint and Kubernetes gateway as identical and strictly follows a mode that is.
Yeah. We could also have like one release where we support the selector and then give a warning. Okay, I think I agree.
We can have 5 releases. We can keep it forever. I'm not saying we should drop the capability to use waypoint sectors for Kubernetes gateways that happen to be, but just not recommend it, not document it, and not to mix it with waypoint.
Okay, so we'd have 2 modes then. We'd have Kubernetes gateway, which is all types, including waypoints and ingress.
And egress at some point, yes, everything.
Yeah, and egress. Okay. I think I like that.
So from the proxy class perspective, we don't need the user to say which gateway type, right?
We may still want to put gateway class waypoint, gateway class ingress, gateway class egress, just for the sake of support, intent.
Yeah,
whatever.
for this table, I understood your point, which I think is a great suggestion. I'm just saying, if you scroll up a little bit, that proxy class, we ask a user to declare on the RC policy. Do they have to tell us? Or can we do that intelligently for the user?
So the intent is that if you leave it unspecified, we give legacy behavior for backwards compatibility, and so they don't have to specify things. But for some things, we do want them to be explicit. So like ztunnel, for example, we only will apply things to ztunnel if they tell us it's for ztunnel because it has different semantics with L7, right?
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we can't make it a required field. So like we have to support that. If you don't set it, it does what it does today.
Which would apply to sidecar and
Which is sidecars and
gateway.
gateways. And
It's very clear cut, very clear user intent. People are opting into the new Kubernetes behavior, or they are sticking with the old Istio behavior. It's just super clear for everyone, easy to support. I don't know why we would bother with any mix.
What if a user specifies proxy class as cTunnel true and then put L7 attributes?
we'll
Where the
reject that
policy-
in the webhook.
Rejecting
So they
webhook
can't call it,
validation, yeah.
That's one of the main reasons for this proposal, actually, is so that users can't do that and then get weird behavior. We can just stop them from doing it.
Okay, so when
Yeah.
user do the kubectl apply, they will get rejection.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, that specific reason is like 95% of the motivation for this proposal, actually. So
How the reverse question? If you have the L4 policy in Waypoint, do we recommend that, or we just don't do that? Just use internal.
that's a good point. We could recommend. I mean, we can even in webhook you can add warnings now, actually. So we could make it a very explicit warning, or just document as best practice.
I think there is another aspect to this discussion, John. If we apply, do you want to apply policy twice, and how does it intermingle? I mean, if you may have some decisions where you allow or deny based on a mix of L7 and L4, and
Yeah.
splitting it in two is extremely tricky and semantically and for users. I would rather have the Waypoint apply L4 and L7 policies together, because then you can make sense of them.
Oh, I absolutely agree. We should not force the user to split them. Like the waypoint has to do both. And
Yeah.
if they want to apply, my initial thinking was if they want to apply a set of policies, which can be mixed, and then an additional set of policies in zTunnel, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think the alternative is maybe you say, okay, at zTunnel, if it's already in the waypoint, don't apply policies. But I don't think that's good from a kind of layering model, right?
No, completely
So
agree.
you could say, for example, like, okay, here's my global policy for zTunnels, require MTLS, for example. And then at the waypoint, you could have a policy that's like on port 80, allow /get request, right? And we would apply both of those policies.
Let's
I
not
don't
go there. To allow MTLS,
So,
because that's a different kind of worms.
The reason why I ask is because, I think we should support a simple policy saying like, service account A should not talk to service account B, right? That seems like a pretty simple use case.
That's all. So it can be applied.
That's
in
all
both
for
ways.
right. But if it's applied at waypoint, you don't know the service account B at waypoint.
That you can only be applied at waypoint, and that's perfectly fine. That's why that's
I
separate.
mean zTunnel, right? Not
In
waypoint.
zTunnel, yes. Yes, yeah. I mean, some policies can be applied at waypoint, some policies cannot be applied at waypoint. Same for zTunnel. I mean, obviously, we decided that you cannot apply any policies that rely on the identity of the endpoint, because, again, it's
Right, but that
authorization
means
after-
that means you cannot use the same policy because at waypoint and zTunnel. So some zTunnel, by definition, has to be more expressive at L4 than waypoint.
I would not say
At all
more
four.
expressive, but each of them have a bit different abilities. So the zTunnel at the end can apply policies that involve identity of both peers, while waypoints, gateways, obviously they don't know the identity of the final destination, so they cannot apply that particular policy. But that's fine. I mean,
So there's a different ability to express things. So
That's why we
having
need
them
both.
under one API is a bit confusing because now your L4 and L7 are not quite the same, and yet they share the spec.
that I agree, but we want to maintain backward. I don't know. That's unfortunate, but necessary if you want to keep backward compatibility.
Yeah, I think L7 is really depend on the deployment, right? If customer want service count granularity, they should really deploy waypoint per service count.
That
instead
may
of
be
per
another option.
namespace. Yeah.
That may be another option, but I would stay away from making anything that saying that API requires deployment model, because we still want to be able to save cost by reusing the. I would rather go with documentation explaining clearly which attributes are used where, where and figure out, wait until Kubernetes Gateway Gamma defines their own authorization, and then maybe move to that, because that would probably be more clear. I don't know.
Yeah, we should document saying, yeah, based on your use case, give a few examples how you want to deploy your waypoints.
So I have a question. So introduction to this proxy class would resolve the OZ TCP issue, like, because right now we have the separation between waypoint and ztunnel, and waypoint can serve to like the broad TCP ports as well if there is any, right? We can resolve this, right? We shouldn't support that TCP thing anymore, right?
No, I think it is still an issue because in the waypoint, you could have a TCP or sniffed port and I have L7 policy. So we do still need the.
But my question is, like, what's the point of using waypoint for the raw TCP port, right? So we shouldn't apply the policies to TCP ports if there's a
waypoint. Like, there's a common misconception, I think, that waypoints are only for L7 attributes. But that's not really the case. It's necessary for L7 because ztunnel doesn't do any L7. But there's plenty of other things that are waypoint only that still apply to L4 traffic. So for example, you could have a WASM policy, right? We're never going to put WASM in the ztunnel. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to have L4 things doing WASM, right? Or like client-side routing overrides for TCP. Like, we're not adding complex routing logic into ztunnel, even for TCP. But that is something that can be expressed in the API in waypoint. So there's still use cases to send through the waypoint for TCP traffic. Not to mention that we don't know if it's TCP or HTTP in the ztunnel, right? So we don't know until we get to the waypoint.
Well, actually, I disagree. I think it should be on the table that eventually L4 will go to ztunnel. There's just no point in having L4 in waypoint. Why would you deploy a whole L7 proxy for L4?
So I'm not saying that we need to have permanently all L4 traffic goes to the waypoint. We can certainly have a user configure things more explicitly and say that this set of traffic, like the granularity is this namespace or this service count. Like, all or nothing goes through the waypoint, right? We could add policies that say this set of traffic, goes to the waypoint and this set can skip. I think that's fine. And that could be based on port or protocol and allow things like that. But there's certainly the possibility, and I would think the default, that TCP does go through the waypoint.
And the different answer is WASM and external Z will probably never be in ztunnel, and they're an important part of the authorization. Gateways, again, the gateway API defines TCP route and TLS route and other things. So the gateways need to support L4 routes for this purpose. But I completely agree with that the TCP hack and the confusion that we had can be resolved with waypoint. So there is no need to continue to support this guess mode where report maybe TCP, maybe L7, maybe L4, and we guess based on sniffing, especially since gateway has clearly separated ports, and you either attach TCP routes or you attach HTTP routes. If you attach an HTTP route, it's clear intent that this is going to be an HTTP port. So I don't think, maybe we can add later a sniffing mode if the gateway API defines sniffing and other vendors adopt it, but I don't think we should take over the sniffing from all these two APIs into waypoints and gateway and gamma. It creates enough problems as it is with complexity and with.
So one more suggestion, like, since we are adding proxy class, is it okay if we add the protocol as well, like Kubernetes network policy? And if it is specifically TCP, then we should ignore that, right? All the 7 attributes.
Well, there's no need to ignore them. We can reject them in the webhook, right?
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's orthogonal discussion. I think it's a good idea, though.
Well, actually, it's a good point, right? I mean, if you are restricting based on if you mix TCP and HTTP ports and you write a policy that's L7, you will be blocking TCP ports, right? Unless you have some kind of port granularity.
Each port should be either L7 or L4. I mean, we should not, mix.
But our policy doesn't, of Z in Istio doesn't have a port as a top level selector. So it applies universally per ports.
No, you can add port. It's not top level, but it's in the to clause. So you can scope down each rule to a specific port.
Yeah, I know, but it's not like a first class. It could be like a range.
Yeah, I mean, like I totally agree. Most people don't use it, and port number and protocol are also not necessarily the same, right? You can. run into issues there. So I agree we should add protocol, but I don't know that it's strictly coupled to this discussion of how ambient and Z-tunnel behave.
Well, I mean, it matters because if you write a policy and your only selection is waypoint, if you have to have TL7 protect one port but allow TCP on the other port, that means you have to now look in the policy and see if it's a port based, and then only then apply it on the HTTP port, which is really complicated to explain. So we might need to have a top level selector at a waypoint saying, for HTTP waypoint, we do this. Well, for a TCP waypoint, we don't do that. And then some other way to refer to protocols.
It's a good point in this way. When you said parent ref, John, didn't you mean exactly the same semantics? And you know, you can refer to a section in the gateway, which implies port. Because parent ref in Kubernetes in Gamma is you know.
I hadn't intended that you could select a section name.
I mean, that's a spec in Kubernetes. What can we do?
Well, no, I mean, there's no sections in waypoints to refer to. So I mean, we define what a section means, right?
Yeah, but in gateway it is a port, so you can attach to port and then
it's a listener, but we don't have any listeners.
A listener, yeah.
We have the empty listener set. So
yes, that's an interesting. We should take it offline and discuss virtual listeners.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand your concern. Is it that if we get a request at waypoint, we have in the policy it's TCP or HTTP, and we don't know that until we pick the backend, or is it something else?
Well, I mean that part too, but I mean it's just hard to explain that our system analyzes this content of the spec, seeing if it's port, and then applies on that port, because it's just seems complex. First of all, port is a backend port, not service port. So now we have to do OFZ, have to do load balancing, which is again a problem.
Right. That is what I realized as you said that I was concerned with. But if we ignore that problem, it seems like you would just add port as an attribute in the RBAC, right? But there is an issue that now it's changing from backend port to service port because it's happening before the VIP resolution.
No, it's the issue is that if you on TCP port, right? You on TP listener and waypoint, you'll just deny all traffic because it's not HTTP if you have HTTP policy.
No, but it's per port. So the policies will not be completely, applied to the entire waypoint or the entire gateway. They will apply to. They must have a port.
Yeah, but the port is a backend port, not the service.
No. The waypoint cannot know it's a backend port. So I don't think anyone expected that you can write a policy in a waypoint or a gateway referring to the backend port, because in a multi-cluster you can have multiple services with different service port and different backend port, and you have a list of ports. So it's not.
I'm referring to the hour of Z port, which is a backend port, not service port.
So when that will probably stay with sidecars. I don't think it can be preserved in gateway or on.
Right, but we have a problem because if your waypoint is per IP, and a mix of TCP and TCP ports, we need to make sure that we don't apply HTTP policy to TCP port. And the only way I don't see a way to do that right now with the per waypoint selector, right? Maybe we just need an example. I don't know how to write it down. Like, how do we write a policy that says only apply on HTTP port?
So I suspect each policy on waypoint will require to have a port. I don't think we can avoid that. And maybe,
yeah. So I mean, so if we add a new field that's like today, how you do it is you say on port 80, I'm applying L7 policies, and it's up to the user to make sure that port 80 is actually HTTP, and that they didn't apply that to the whole namespace and some other service runs TCP on port 80, right? It's not amazing. That's why Arian's suggestion is we add protocol, TCP or HTTP, and say this policy only applies to HTTP, and then they don't have to manually figure it out, right? So, I mean, in the waypoint for a service, we know if it's HTTP or not. For a pod, I guess it's a bit harder there because we don't have as much info in the XDS as today, right? But for each, that becomes problematic there.
Maybe we need explicit TCP and HTTP waypoint somewhere. so that it's more explicit? Which waypoint you want?
I agree explicit is good, but we need to figure out the granularity. I don't think we should have 2 waypoints, but we clearly need to disambiguate and avoid confusion in the waypoint.
Is that something we can calculate for the user automatically?
It's user intent. How can I guess it? That's the problem. We tried with sniffing, but it's not ideal.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so the API is easy to misuse today, but is it any worse in the waypoint? Like if you apply an L7 policy to TCP ports, they're denied and you messed up and you shouldn't do that. Does that work still in waypoint? It seems like it does. There is the issue that now port refers to the service port, not the backend port. But given that they're explicitly applying this to a waypoint with the class, maybe that's okay that the semantics are somewhat changed.
I mean, I agree. It's not worse,
Yeah.
but it's not good either.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
it's strictly better. It's strictly better if the restrictions, if in waypoint we put restriction to validation and through requirements that you must have a port and you must be either TCP or HTTP and you need to be explicit. I think it's a win for everyone because it's removing the confusion we had inside in the old API where we cannot change it because of backward compatibility, ossification, and legacy. But with waypoint, we have the opportunity to, remove the confusion that we found in sidecars.
Yeah, I don't disagree that explicit's probably better, but I don't know. It sounds like this is we're trying to avoid a human problem, and before adding something to an API, it's it might be worth looking into what other ways we can help solve the human problem. Maybe that's more tooling, adding something it's just detail analyze. Again, doesn't necessarily solve the entire problem, but if we can mitigate it and maybe coach users, that might be preferable to adding something to the API that we have to maintain forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest thing is just to say waypoints on HTTP in alpha. I mean, just don't do TCP. I mean, the use cases you mentioned was some network filters. I don't know anyone using that, at least in my.
We don't know if it's TCP or until it gets to the waypoint. And we're not going to sniff in Z-tunnel, right?
John, I think Quat has actually a very good point. V1 of Ambient could do waypoint only for HTTP, and
how do you know if it's HTTP?
By edict, we're saying that waypoints are used for L7, and for L4 we are just using Z-tunnel with a reduced API surface. I mean, without M7, and then in V2 we can, based on what Gamma gateway are doing, we can introduce, because that's exactly what gateway did. I mean, they launched with HTTP only with HTTP route, and TCP stuff is still in alpha and not supported by most gateway implementations. If JKE gateway doesn't support TCP route, why would the sky fall if V1 Ambient only ships with less testing?
What if you have a TCP workload? Like what literally happens to the traffic?
So either you are not using Z-tunnel for the TCP traffic, or you use sidecars. So if you necessarily have a policy that cannot be expressed with Z-tunnels, then you keep using sidecar. If it can be expressed with Z-tunnel, no problem.
But there's no way to sorry, go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, I think we're going to say the same thing. Like, how do you enforce that? Right? Like, you don't like a customer may not know, right? Like they should know, right? But
we just
they don't think about it. They run gRPC.
No, but the only thing that has a protocol associated with it is a service.
Yes.
So on the server waypoint, or sorry, the server Z-tunnel, we get a request always to a pod IP, and we need to say this had to have gone through the waypoint, or it's fine to not go through a waypoint. But a pod IP doesn't have a protocol associated with it, so there's no way for Z-tunnel to ever say this request should have gone to a waypoint, which means that no requests need to go through a waypoint.
It does. I mean, it's not the request to a pod IP, it's a request to pod IP and port. And we have the container port, which has a name, and we have the service port, which has a name. So even if you go to 8080, 8080 is a target port for service. So we can either explicitly or define what are the HTTP ports that we are concerned about, and have the target ports.
I mean, it's kind of murky. I could have two services for one pod pointing at the same port, say one's HTTP, one's TCP, Now, when I request, like there's the clients and the server view are completely different, right?
I'm sure we can resolve this ambiguity and be explicit about what ports are selected as HTTPs, and much easier than than combining TCP. So, and it's not bad to have explicit HTTP. So if you have HTTP, I think it's application port, target port. There are plenty of ways to be explicit and the problem is still the same. Regardless of what we are doing, that's a fundamental problem. How to identify TCP versus HTTP? We tried with sniffing, we tried with guessing, we tried many things, but
it's also easier to have exceptions for HTTP services to have TCP rather than the other way, having TCP services have exceptions for HTTP. So if its intent is to support HTTP services, we can guess, maybe some TCP ports, and maybe that's explicit by user, by naming. But it's much easier problem to solve than trying to universally guess what's HTTP, TCP.
Yeah, guessing is wrong. I think that's my fundamental, because you can guess wrong, and if it's policy involved, it's always dangerous to guess wrong.
Yeah, so the fact that it's TCP is explicit, but we still have to support TCP ports and HTTP services. So it could be like an exception there, but it's different than saying everything is just can be either. Because once you have an intent that says it's HTTP, you have to honor that intent, and that's easier to do.
I don't know, I'm a bit conflicted. Like I agree that less guessing is better, but at the same time, like one of the goals of Ambient is easy onboarding, and we know that before we had sniffing, the issue every single person that adopted EAST2 had was that they had to go rename every port in their entire mesh to get functionality right. So we'd be kind of taking many steps backwards if we add that requirement back.
John, it's not necessarily that way. I mean, it's easy onboarding. Everything is TCP by default. No change in behavior compared to Kubernetes. You can deploy Ambient with absolutely no problem. Now you want to apply L7 policies. What do? You create a waypoint. That's already intent. You apply the policies. That's already intent. That we don't need to guess anything. If the user deployed a waypoint on port 80, and we know that target port is 8080.
Well, they don't deploy a waypoint on port though today. They just deploy a waypoint.
They deploy a waypoint and deploy a policy. I mean, the policy, they put HTTP routes, there is intent involved with attaching L7 policies, attaching L7 routes, and doing L7 stuff. So that's
But not for OSZ though, right?
But we don't
They
want
don't
users to need a
necessarily.
route either.
Yeah,
No,
but routes is no guaranteed, right? So for OSZ policy, they don't necessarily specify the port.
So they would use a waypoint if they need a waypoint. So if they need some L7, so they need to express the intent to use L7 somehow. How do you do it? You either create a policy or L7 policy, or you create and that refers to ports. I mean, you need to put some ports because you don't want to apply the L7 policy broadly to absolutely everything under the sky. So when you create either an HTTP route or anything that declares the intent that you want a particular service or port to be L7, you are done. You don't have to do any guessing. And if you don't do anything, then it's TCP. That means you don't care. I mean, if a particular port or it's not doesn't have anything L7 referred to it, then bypass.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the intent that when they declare, they don't necessarily associate with the port number, right? Because like OSZ policy, or if they do deploy the waypoint for telemetry, they don't necessarily declare the port number. I mean, routes, I think people understand there would be a port number associated with it. But
Yeah,
the
I can
other
imagine
policies.
like you apply a policy that says deny all traffic, for example, at L7 to the waypoint, and but my traffic still works.
But why would you even allow a policy that denies all traffic to a waypoint?
It's just an example. It could be something that denies some traffic, most traffic, whatever, right? It denies something, and then it's not denying anything, though, right? Because it's not even going to the waypoint. It becomes a bit confusing, I think, what is actually happening. I mean, I like parts of it for sure, but I'm certainly not sold I have some concerns for sure.
Ray, what's your?
Yes. So I think my question is about will we take a similar approach of the gateway API to be explicit, like a HTTP route, a TCP route, basically in the policy name or the policy itself, be explicit about whether it's for L7 or for L4, or I just wish to know the current direction will in that explicit direction or something, deduced from, I guess, deduced rather than, being explicit.
I personally, the reason I'm strongly for explicit is because I think everything that we do implicit comes with a cost, and we know the cost that we had with sidecars.
And also the cost is also this detection is not reliable, and when it is not reliable, some security vulnerability, for example, can happen, right? For example, in the authorization policy case.
Well, to be clear, we fail closed, so that's not really.
That's again, the cost is not only in security. It's you have to go to waypoint for waypoint to guess if you're doing HTTP or TCP, versus TCP goes straight through. And if you actually want L7 telemetry, you opt in for L7 telemetry. You pay the price for the hop, and you get L7 telemetry. You don't want it, you get L4 telemetry, and it's cheaper. So anything that will involve an extra hop should have an intent behind it. Should never put an extra hop without user saying, "Hey, this is L7, I need waypoint."
So suppose
Yeah,
if we have something like a TCP policy full or TCP policy bar that only apply to Z-tunnel, and HTTP policy full or HTTP policy bar only apply to waypoint, will this with this approach conforming to the gateway API standard, or what's the wrong of that being explicit? Is that basically user need to be conscious about whether they are defining L4, L7, or we want to somehow reduce the user's burden of specify the layer? Or I'm a little bit unsure which the direction we prefer, or what's the concern there regarding to being explicit.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I was going to say, like, the intent is still explicit in the current design. It's just a more coarse-grained explicit signal, right? So, we could have at the pod level, there's different levels of where we can explicitly opt in. I think it's worth visiting, but I guess we don't have much time to discuss other topics. But I think we should.
John, I think we have consensus, at least for some part of this proposal. I think for L7, I don't think there are major concerns about what we should do in terms of policy and other things. And we can take what Ethan was saying earlier, an incremental approach, and do exactly the same thing that Gateway did. Move with HTTP first and super explicit intent, and then add more flexibility later, because that will allow us to ship Ambient faster with more strength, because we'll focus on the L7 and the things where waypoint is absolutely necessary, and doesn't stop us from doing it later, a more guest-based approach.
Well, that's the thing. I have some concerns that it can actually be implemented at all, let alone quickly. I certainly get that we could implement selectively sending to the waypoint or not. The question is, can we verify on the other end that the path was respected as required by the policies? So,
if you're very explicit, you have to require, hey, to use waypoint and get all these wonderful features, you need to continue to put a name for the port. in the container spec or in the service. It's not a regression. We already require it, and it's, you get a lot of value by putting that explicit intent. I don't see how it would not be possible to implement it.
So shall we revisit this, John, after you've given some thoughts on implementation?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're out of time too. I don't think we'll have time for any other topics, but there are a couple of topics. So please take time to take a look of the doc offline. Maybe we can discuss next time. Do we have time to discuss the gateway naming briefly? Because it might be
Gateway naming? I mean, we're out of
Yeah.
time, but I don't even know what you're talking about, so maybe. Oh, here's
the
one.
last one. Yeah, the last one.
Oh,
item
yeah,
on
yeah,
the agenda.
Sure, we
That
can
might
talk
be
about it.
quick. Yeah. So yeah. So Greg, you want to talk about that? I can present
Yep,
for
sure.
you.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So this just came up in a recent commit from John. Previously, we were appending a dash proxy, waypoint proxy name for all of our waypoint proxies. And I guess that recently changed to be more in line with the ingress scope, but I noticed it kind of results in some conflicts. Specifically, if you deploy a gateway resource for example, just using HTTP bin, and you name that gateway resource HTTP bin, it actually ends up trying to create a deployment that is the same as the already existing HTTP bin deployment, and so it doesn't actually get created. Meanwhile, the service accounts that get created for this proxy or this waypoint proxy are still appending this dash proxy suffix on there. So I guess this is just kind of discussion of what the norm should be, whether or not we want to keep it in line with gateway or keep appending the suffix on the end. Personally, I feel like a lot of users just tend to name their things the same. So like if you have a backend service HTTP bin, and you have a virtual service and destination rule for that, you end up naming those HTTP bin too. So it just kind of seems like they fall into the same line of logic when they try and create a waypoint proxy for HTTP bin. But if anybody else wants to weigh in, there's some discussion there in the issue already, but just trying to get a sense of what the community would expect the proper action to be.
I would say at the very least, I expect waypoints and ingress gateway to behave the same. So whatever we decide for one should apply to the other as well, which also probably means that waypoint's a bad suffix. Maybe it should be dash gateway or something.
So do we append for a gateway today? I assume no.
We don't currently, but we could add
Okay.
that feature is experimental, so we can do whatever needs to be done there.
Might be good to append for gateway too, because the user might deploy dedicated gateway for their app, right? If it's a high priority app.
Sure, that's true. Yeah.
But the spec allows, if you have both a waypoint and a gateway with the same name, or multiple gateway and the waypoints with the same name, we are allowed to concatenate them and to have a single deployment that combines both, or the previous discussion where the representation, the physical representation of the waypoint gateway, multiple waypoints, multiple namespaces can be combined however necessary. Am I making sense? Or
so are you saying HTTP bin ingress gateway could also be HTTP bin's waypoint?
why not? I mean, there are different ports. One is on 150.9 and the other one is on 80. And especially if infrastructure provided gateways, there is no restriction. I mean, you can do whatever combination you need that is efficient.
Interesting. Because if that's the case, then append wouldn't, I guess, would be confusing.
Gateway class, I mean, if you have different gateway classes, then maybe we can concatenate the gateway class with the gateway name, because if you have internal load balancer and externals, then you definitely cannot combine them. But within the single class, you can combine. So if one is mesh, the other class is internet or whatever you use for internet. Do you use anything? I don't remember. Then it would definitely make sense because
Istio, I think. So.
Istio and Istio mesh, but then we cannot combine them because and then it will make sense because you can have same name, different classes. They cannot create the same resource. So
I do kind of like that. Append the class, and we could rename the class to Waypoint if we don't like Istio mesh as well.
Yeah, probably something without Istio would be more interesting for other vendors too.
Yeah,
because I think
it's
that
the Istio implementation though. If they want Nginx match, they could,
yeah, but they deploy the controller. I mean, they shouldn't have to change their config because they want to use Istio Linkerd. So it's when you put get class mesh class. I don't know.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, in the original examples, they had like class internet. I mean, technically, the user can name the class whatever they want. That's just the defaults we come out of the box with. I feel like we can't say that we're mesh by default because, or I mean, we certainly couldn't say that we're internet by default because you could easily have, 10 different Ingress controllers, right? But a user could decide, okay, I only use Istio. Istio is called internet. Mesh, it's a bit less likely to have multiple, but
some aliasing and tagging will be useful. So, and you could have class internet that has some fields that or annotations that points to Istio. So just like we do with revisions in IstioD.
Yeah, you can have multiple classes point to the same controller. That works today.
And also you can have some classes probably that could be. Remember we have a bug or discussion about how to support revisions with gateway classes.
Yeah,
it's kind of the same issue about creating some sort of internet class which can point to Istio. It's an alias, a tag, or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, it sounds like I feel like there's some agreement here to add the class to the name.
Yeah. And the class, maybe we should consider something else than Istio mesh. I think it's pretty confusing the way we have.
Yeah, I'd be fine. I was thinking of renaming it for other reasons as well. I thought it was confusing. I think Waypoint makes the most sense, or Istio Waypoint,
yeah,
either one.
I think so too. I think Keith was asking that on the design doc the other day too. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Does it make sense that the same suffix is appended for the service account too?
Yeah, I think it should be all resources.
Yeah.
And also for gateway, for ingresses, we should create a service account because today I think we're using default, which is not good.
Oh, absolutely.
Although it is kind of a high permission to create service account, but I think that ship has kind of sailed the Waypoint plans. So.
Okay, cool. I guess that's it for today. Thanks so much. And then we'll align the topics for next week, the remainder of the topics. Bye, everyone.